Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, understand that in government side of the house, we are going to choose general scattered paths, and in opposition, they are going to choose a specialist scattered path. Okay, so how is our mechanism? We are not going to focus on one thing, but instead we are going to learn about everything that is possible under our side of the house. So 3 things that we need to understand here. First, this is an average student. Their ability is just standard, right? They might able to pass minimum score as a minimum score standard, but understand that it is impossible for them to having, for example, first rank and so on and so forth. Talking about the option, general scattered path is not as hard as specialist, right? Because understand, if you would choose, for example, to have general like the generalist scattered path, meaning that you could be adaptive to every kind of job that is exists under your side, under current status quo that I will explain more in my substantive. But compare when these kind of students choose to becoming a specialist, meaning that it is only meaning that the option for them on choosing a certain job is very limited, right? Because understand that they are a specialist, right? Meaning that there is some aspect that they are more otherwise the other aspect is not at all. They didn't even have basic about that, so on and so forth. So how we identify this kind of people as an average student? We say that we see that, for example, from their IQ test, for example, or physiological tests, on and so forth. We say that in those particular score, they are average. So there will be no question coming from opposition side of the house on how we could identify this kind of people. But second, understand that they are lower socioeconomic status, right? Understand that in this kind of particular developing country, when we are talking about lower social economic status, meaning that it is really hard for them to compete with, for example, people that is having a better socioeconomic status, especially when you are choosing to become a specialist. Most likely specialist is those people that is gifted to begin with. And also understand that these people only an average student, meaning that it is hard for them to develop in the end of the day. But thirdly, understand that this is developing country, right? The condition force you to become adaptive. It is exclusive under our side of the house, because in our side, for example, when the crisis might happen, especially in this developing country, right, it is really accessible for this country to having crisis. When these crises happen, it is exclusive under our side of the house that these people could adapt this to other kind of job. In compared to their side of the house, when, for example, crisis happen, when they, for example, impeach from their job, meaning that they couldn't go to other job because they are a specialist. Their chosen job is very limited, right? So moving on to my substantive, 2 points that I will explain in my speech. First is why generalist path is really important for this kind of particular people, especially when they are in low economic status in developing country. But second, I will explain to you why it is going to create a better life for this kind of particular individual. So first, talking about why generalist path is really important for this kind of an individual, right? Understand that this kind of individual, what they really need to begin with is to fulfilling their basic needs, because understand it is a low socioeconomic status, meaning that they have, for example, their parents, their brother, their sisters, so on and so forth, that they need to, for example, feed for. They need to give them money for in order for them to survive in their daily life. Their needs is a lot of need, for example, so on and so forth. We say that first, when you are choosing to becoming a specialist, meaning that there's so many things that you need to do. For example, you need to go to school, you need to go to higher school, so on and so forth. We say that it is inaccessible for this kind of people, even when, for example, opposite side of the house say that there's already a scholar and so on and so forth. We say that this kind of particular scholar only accessible for these people that is not an average status, right? Understand that this scholar, when you apply, no thank you, when you, for example, wanted to apply for a scholar, you will have a test. When you wanted to pass a test, meaning that you should have a better ability than the other people, and we say that this ability didn't exist in this kind of average people, because they are only average. They only able to, for example, pass the minimum score, but they are not able to begin the first rank, right? Understand about this kind of particular things, meaning that they are it is really hard for them to being competitive in the end of the day. So we say when these people choose to being specialists, it is hard to pay, for example, for their specialist schools, so on and so forth. In the end of the day, it will be harder for them to fulfilling their basic needs in the end of the day. And we say that under our side of the house, when these people choose, for example, to being a general career path, mean that there's already so much option in the current status quo. They could go to every kind of job that is available under government side of the house. We say that this old job is really important for them to fulfilling their basic needs, so on and so forth. We say that talking about transferability, we say that when you choose to being a specialist, like I said before, when, for example, a crisis might happen, or you might there's a condition that you couldn't predict, you couldn't go out from that job simply because you are a specialist. You couldn't go to other job because of this kind of particular things. And understand, when you are out from this kind of particular job, means that your needs couldn't be fulfilling anymore because you're already out from that job. When you couldn't fulfilling your job anymore, you are a low socioeconomic status. Your parents didn't have sustained your parents didn't have a stable condition, and so on and so forth, meaning that it will be harder for you to survive in the end of the day. But second, let's talk about why it is going to create a better life for this kind of particular individual. Because we say in government side of the house, these people choose to be a generalist, right? Understand, when they choose to be a generalist, even, for example, they choose to go for example, to being a to work in a particular job, they will be able to have a higher position time by time. We say that it is okay when this take over time, they still have income that they could able to fulfill their needs, so on and so forth. So we said to have higher position time by time. So we said about survivability, so on and so forth. They are accessible to a wider range of jobs, so on and so forth. We also say that compared to compete, for example, when you choose, for example, to being a specialist and you have to compete with other, talking about, for example, a doctor specialist, they all their parents, for example, is also a doctor. When we're talking about their parents is also a doctor, also, of course, they already given so many advantages, and we think that these kind of particular average people will not able to compete with this kind of particular people. Based on this all reason, fair.
Great. I thank the Prime Minister for the speech. To continue the debate, I'll call upon Leader of Opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. My speech will start in three, 2, 1. We agree that education should nurture yourself, but what's more important for lower socioeconomic background is in developing country is for them how to survive and break from their echo chamber of poverty, ladies and gentlemen. This is something that's really important and exclusive for students that come from lower socioeconomic background. Usually, those people, if there are no significant changes in their family, their poverty will going to be passed later on, ladies and gentlemen. Exactly under this reason, we think that focusing on specialists will going to become a very a better option in terms of longevity and stability for the student at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. So that is why, in all, our stand is, as an average student, we're going to develop a specialist career in our work. For example, we're going to develop a specialty. We're going to go to vocational school, for example, or going to develop our own skill within our own capability to be a specialist rather than competing in general school to become a generalist, like what Oji said at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. Before moving on to my speech, let's take a look at what OG have bring into this debate. First thing first, we're talking about they cannot trust you how specialist job is very hard and how it's very limited job, right? Well, that simply this is not true, ladies and gentlemen, because the most likely scenario that happened in our side, even if the students are average at the end of the day, we think that average students will going to choose in our side, will going to choose a specialized that they know they could do, ladies and gentlemen. We think that this kind of talent that average student will going to choose will going to be coexist with what they could do at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. This is very important, especially in developing country, which is something that is never brought by OG, right? We think that in developing country, the government of developing country also constantly provided a vocational school and constantly focus their students to focus on developing specific skill rather than a general skill at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. Take a look at how Indonesian government focus their students to go to vocational school instead of regular SMA, for example, ladies and gentlemen. This means to you, in developing country, they are a shifting change from generalist to specialist at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. But even if, in our worst scenario, if they cannot go to vocational school, if they are that bad, we think that, ladies and gentlemen, in outside of the house, some specialist jobs also didn't require any formal education, ladies and gentlemen. For example, you could be trained to become a barber, for example. That is not require a specific school threshold. Comparatively, in government side of the house, within the opening government, when you want to become a generalist, you have to excel in certain threshold of education. You have to basic education to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. This is something that is going to be a burden for this average student from social economic at the end of the day, because in outside of the house we didn't have any permanent threshold on what this student have to do to become a specialist at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. So that is why the argument on how specialist job is hard and it's very limited is not going to be exist. But secondly, how they talk about crisis might happen. We think that no, we think that exactly when crisis happen, generalists will often going to become put under the table. Why? Because especially generalists cannot focus on one thing. In crisis, those kind of people will going to be not prioritized, ladies and gentlemen. Comparatively in specialist job, the exclusivity of specialist job is there's always a need in this. There's always a demand in society for those kind of specialists to access to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. We think that it's unfair for government to assume that this student will going to choose a specialist that is not needed. No, we think that average student will going to become a specialist in job that they know they will going to be demand and constant demand at the end of the day in the society at the end of the day. So comparatively, crisis could also damage those who choose to become a generalist at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. So that is my response. Moving on to my case, I'm going to explain to you why a specialist job is the most effective way for us average students to be economically stable, not just in short term, but also long term, ladies and gentlemen. We think that you have to characterize what education means. We think that education should nurture the potential of you and your career. But as an average student from low socioeconomic, we think that what's more important is to survive economically, to break from the poverty echo chamber that exists in your family and will going to be most likely passed on your children, ladies and gentlemen. This is very important. This is very important background for lower income community. To not live paycheck to paycheck, ladies and gentlemen. We have to break this echo chamber, right? But because we agree that hopes and risks are important, but we think that excel at many things is very good. But we think that life is about compromise, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm going to explain to you why chasing specialist job is the only way you could at least have economically stable and breaking the echo chamber from poverty. We think that when you're talking about specialist job, you are going to be excel at one thing, have a specific skill set, ladies and gentlemen. For example, you're going to be a barber, technician, operator, and so on and so forth. We have to characterize developing country first. We think that in developing country, they are putting much focus on developing a specific industry, ladies and gentlemen. They are shifting from generalist to specific focus provider, right? In developing country, they need a focus. There is a constant need of focus on industry. A specific industry is necessary, ladies and gentlemen. That's why every skill set matter in developing country, ladies and gentlemen. But what are other exclusivity of a specialist, ladies and gentlemen? We think that in long term, ladies and gentlemen, those people, those companies will going to be prioritize you because you know you are the best at that. You are the best at what you do. You're going to be always prioritized. You're always going to try to survive, ladies and gentlemen. That's why comparatively with operating government side of the house, we talk about generalists. But in generalists, exactly because they are unable to focus at one thing, company in the case of this developing country we're going to be developed, will not going to prioritize those who are unable to focus at one thing, ladies and gentlemen. We think that the end goal of every developing country is develop a certain industry that could adapt towards the society and make them and raise the GDP at the end of the day. This is why specialization or specialists will going to be better even at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. But let's talk about our worsening scenario for lower income, especially when you're talking about for lower income community, when maybe they cannot attend vocational school and so on and so forth. Within that, in specialist job, it's easier for us to open certain jobs, ladies and gentlemen. Why? Because usually in specialist job, you didn't have to go to certain standard of certain standard of school comparatively to become a generalist, ladies and gentlemen. In specialist job, you could open your own job. For example, if you are develop your skill set to be to be a barber, you could you could easily become a freelance barber on your own, ladies and gentlemen. This is very much better and very and much easier for us to gain at least some kind of money comparatively to become a generalist, because you have to wait certain you have to wait certain years or pass certain exam to become a generalist, right? Especially in generalist specialty, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we think that even in our worsening scenario, when there are no other vocational school, for example, we think that there are still many mechanisms in specialty job that this lower income average student could access at the end of the day, right? But the most important part in our start is the long term, ladies and gentlemen. We expect this country will become developed, right, at the end of the day. And exactly because they are specialized at what they do, they will going to have at least certain stability to break from their echo chamber of poverty at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why I already explained to you why how become a specialist job is the most important thing for us to get economically stable and break our echo chamber of poverty. That's why we're proud to oppose.
I think I'll offer the speech to continue the case of OG. I call upon Deputy Prime Minister.
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Guys, if you want to POI, just type a message. I will see in the chat box. Okay. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think that both sides need to admit that how this is exactly this is exactly the best way to survive. But which side that actually going to prove to you what kind of strategic way that will happen and why those kinds of things will be effective to cater the life of these kinds of low and average people to begin with. We think that the specialist definition that comes by the opening of position is not that really important because they told you about barber specialists and so on and so forth. But they also neglect the fact that there are lots of specialists outside that has been standardized by the society that you need to achieve those kinds of specialists to begin with, such as specialists like doctor, like scientists, like engineer, and so on and so forth. You need to achieve those kinds of things if you are, it means that you are also able to identify a successful person. That is why we say that this kinds of glorification is not really harmful, and that is why we say that the opening opposition told you by their definition is not justified to begin with. So before I jump to into my argument, let me rebut the actually this principal argument that comes by the opening opposition, that they told you that specialist is based on what people's like, and this is important because in most of cases these kinds of people will enjoy their job and so on and so forth. First response, we say that this is not really happen in the status quo, ladies and gentlemen, because what happened in the current status quo, the impacts you have a job is always based on a social standard. You always have those kinds of demand to achieve those kinds of social standard in order to be a good doctor, for example, in order for gaining a better PhD, for example, outside of the nation, for example. We say that this is really harmful to the average student, especially when they are living under low economic stability, ladies and gentlemen. That is why we say that their points about how this kinds of specialist is based on people demands is not that really exclusive. But secondly, students in the current status quo are not fully able to identify their their potential to begin with, ladies and gentlemen, because we are talk about students in especially in developing state, that in most of cases, the process on how they identify their potential is not that equal, ladies and gentlemen. Just take a look what happened in Indonesia, for example, when students in Java is more likely are having ability to identify their capability, but in compared to people in Papua, in Sulawesi, there are lots of students that actually unable to identify those kinds of potential, ladies and gentlemen. Even though they want to engage into those kinds of identification, they need to pass a lot of tests, especially when it comes to a psychological task, academic task that must spend a lot of money for you, ladies and gentlemen. Even if opposition want to say that being a barber shop is going to be easy, but also it's also need money, ladies and gentlemen. And we don't think it's going to be strategy when you are facing a crisis, especially in COVID pandemic. For example, you need to able to have such kinds of process of adjustment into find a better job, ladies and gentlemen. That is why we say that their argument is not valid at the end of the day. So two things in my speech, right? How it's going to create better individual development, and secondly, how it will create better change to our state, at least to developing state that's still unable to cater the education of their students to begin with. We need to understand that the problem in the current status quo, government also are not able to provide a lot of education, and also cater it to all people and also to all students in this country, ladies and gentlemen. Even though that they say that the scholarship exists, it's going to only benefit the privileged people. It's going to only benefit the people that have a very, very high average ability, ladies and gentlemen. In the status quo, we are living under capitalistic world that has a very hard competition, that also even coerce people to having such ability, at least to survive and to fulfill their basic needs, ladies and gentlemen. That is why our stance is that really clear, that we want to at least these people at the very best is going to have and cater their basic needs. So understand that, talk about average people, right? Especially in developing state, most of them are not privileged. If they want to enter in school or university that very, very best, for example, like UGM, ITB, even though that they are not they are actually not going to access these kinds of education, most of people that comes to those kinds of institutions is actually above average. If those people actually average people, at least they already have a sustainable economic ability, because they can engage in such a program to enter into those kinds of institutions, ladies and gentlemen. So we say that what kind of individual development that we want to create in our side, because the problem in the status quo process on glorification about the specialist careers is always exists, but the problem also, in order for you to become a specialist, is really limited for you. Firstly, because you have less access, not only in terms of your ability, just like what my first speaker already explained to you, but secondly, you have less ability to pay for those kinds of education, especially when you want to become a doctor, you want to become a scientist, engineer, for example. You need to afford and also pay millions of money, especially when you want to enter in a very incredible institution, just like UGM, UI, ITB. You need to spend a lot of money, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, we don't think that the government is actually able to provide you this thing. This is harmful, because understand, we are living under low social economic status that opposition also need to defend this case. You need to pay for others' family, for other member of your family, right, ladies and gentlemen, just like your sister, your brother that also needs to engage in this kinds of particular education. So comparative, they need to compromise the other member of their family simply because their parents' money always spent to the average student, ladies and gentlemen. At least in our side of the house, it's going to create better opportunity to all members of family to access these kinds of education, even though that they are going to say that this is not going to be to gaining a better success. At least we still have the process on how you can improve in your job. For example that you are a bank teller, you also can gain a higher position in your job. But secondly, how it will create better change to our state. Understand that you are living under developing state, that there are lots of economical development, that are lots of startup companies that increase, lots of economical crisis that also might be happen. At least in our side of the house, people will have more ability to gain better access and also easier for them to adjust in every kinds of crisis that might be happen at the end of the day. At least our students are going to have a more ability to access a freedom and also access a better education and also process of adjustment. So really proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, DPM, for the speech. To continue the debate, I call upon Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you. Let me set my. Okay, before coming to my argument, we'll talk about what the OG has been talking about, right? Their whole argument is dependent on saying that this kind of specialist career need a very high payment to the education itself. But my first speaker already explained to you that actually the one that need a degree is a generalist career type, because you need an SD degree, SMP degree, SMA degree. While in specialist, I think it's very unfair for the government side of the house to say that specialist is only like PhD or specialist doctor. We say that chef is also a specialist career path, and also like barber is a specialist career path, because you have a specific skill set. And this is why we define the specialist type is by the saying that they have specific skill set, because other people doesn't have, the normal people that doesn't receive training doesn't have this kind of skill set in the very first place. And the argument is dependent on saying that we are expensive and they cannot reach that. But actually, their education also need money and also need bigger pay, because government also cannot create this kind of free education for all. But in our side of the house, this kind of cooking for chef, or maybe this cutting hair for barber can be trained by people who you know, or maybe a courses that is less cheaper and spend less time than this kind of general situation in the very first place. Therefore, they're saying that we are expensive and hard to get is very false. And that they say, and the argument that they said that this kind of generalist is easier to get, but that is coming to my argument, and that is why this kind of generalist job is easy to is open but easy hard to get and easier to lose. Coming to my first argument, why generalist work is harder to get and easier to lose, because many people contend for it, right? Because many basic people has the knowledge to do this kind of basic generalist work in the very first place, right? Because it didn't need some particular skill set. And as an average student, you doesn't really have something to beat other people, because if there are 10 people with the same average and you're contending to a generalist career path and you don't have any particular skill set and specific skill set, it means it is bigger dependent towards luck out of the 10 of you, because there is no thing that edge you above the other worker in the very first place. And secondly, it's probably low paying job, because no special skills is needed. There is no company would pay this kind of generalist job a higher pay. So that's why it is very bad for this kind of lower socioeconomic in the first place. Like, but the thing that we want to stress is there is no bargaining power for you as a generalist worker. Because what? If you bargain for higher wages, company just find another worker that will accept their own wages, for example. This is where it is very bad for this kind of lower socioeconomic, because firstly, you are pushed into a work that you are not really irreplaceable, you have a low paying job, and you don't have negotiating power in the very first place. And why we are saying easy to lose? Because there are so many replacements for you. For example, if this kind of requirement, if you need to know about basic maths or about basic communicating skill, then other people like the company can say, well, the other person can also do that. I don't see why you are the only people that can do this and why I should choose you. And this is why it is very hard to get this kind of journalist work in the very first place. And you are not an integral part of the company. So you are very easy to let go. Once you feel that once the company feel that you are not to a certain standard, that is probably very high. For example, you are working in a factory, you're working very hard and you have to set this kind of target that is very hard to achieve. And one time you don't achieve that, they just say, well, I will try another person, because they're easy to replace you in the very first place, right? And that is why we believe that this kind of work, journalist work, is hard to get and easy to lose. That is why for this kind of lower socioeconomic is not the best type. And coming to my second argument, why it fulfills the need for this particular class, right? The specialist job in the very first place. This kind of specialist job gives you stability and good pay, which is already explained by my first speaker in the very first place. Because if you are not easily replaced by other people, and you have a good pay because you're not a generalist, you need a specific skill set, and the specific skill set comes with the higher wages. But what is more important for this lower social economy, right? They need more help from the company. For example, you need health support, you need this kind of holiday pay and maternal leave and fixed and pay sick leave. And this kind of thing is very important for this kind of lower socioeconomic, right? Because in the lower socioeconomic, they don't have many expenses to actually cover this kind of thing like health and so on and so forth, right? So we need this kind of company to actually help cover it for us. But if you're a generalist, you cannot expect for the company to give you that because you are very easily replaceable. Yes, I'll take from OG.
We say that exactly. We need to being a generalist. At least people can easier to find another job in your site whenever the corporation is bankrupt. It's so hard for you to afford another kinds of company.
Okay. But even if you're easy to find another job, it only means that you are fulfilling the requirement. Doesn't mean you're easily pivot to another company. Doesn't mean if your company bankrupt, then you move to another company and you're magically accepted, because there are many other people that can already do your job. So in this case, you don't win because you are still not the main contender. So the specific point that we're gonna tell about this developing country, right? In this kind of developed country, we have a big population, meaning there's many people that is contending for every job available. Because in this kind of developing country, people will take any job available, and there is the generalist type of work. But if you take that kind of career path, it means that you are contending in a very crowded situation. If you're going to take a generalist, it's more likely in the developed nation because they are lower population and higher education, meaning some basic generalist career path is actually not desirable by most other people, meaning there is less competition. But that is if you are in a developed country. In a developing country, there are still many people who just take any work that is available for them. So in our side of the house, we already explained to you why we have stability, because we are irrepressible, because companies are not easy to replace us. The second is we have more negotiating power, which means more benefit for this worker, which is very needed for this kind of lower social economy in the developing country, because there are many crises, there are many kind of changes in this world, and we need more helping net. We need more safety net, and that's come only if you have negotiating power. If you don't, then just tough luck. You're just gonna probably get sacked and just become another people who are preparing to get into another job that you won't get because you're probably not the bigger contender in the very first place. What the CG must give you is why they can give that, and why what CO must give to you is other thing other than stability and this kind of safe and negotiating power, because we already explained to you very clearly. Thank you very much. I think we agree to not propose this motion.
Great. Thank you for the speech. To open the closing half of the debate, I call upon the government member.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, I invite you to look back what is the goal of the opposition side of the house. Firstly, they say that they want to escape from the poverty chamber, right? Which is why they want to become a specialist, because it will give them a good pay. But understand, from all the example that OO bring to us, first they say that they could become a barber or a safe, and they contradict the idea of OG when education is expensive. But let's see in this kind of scenario, if they become a barber without any kind of formal education, which means their barber will going to be at least a low class shop, right? Which means that people will not be interested anyway, because it is a low class of barber. Because in terms of a specialist occupation, you have to have a high degree of skill for you to be seen as feasible and interesting to other people. But let's say the second problem then, because if you want to become a specialist and then you open a barber or you become a chef, then there is only going to be two possibilities for you to access this career. It's either you start your own shop or you become an employee for other, right? But because this person is coming from a low social economic family, which means that they will not have the model anyway to open this kind of open this kind of shop. And even if they want to apply towards other, if they want to apply to become an employee towards other shop, then this means these people will have to have a degree of formal education to be seen as potential, to be seen as interesting, to then be invited towards this kind of company. So this means that their rebuttal and defense of formal education doesn't important in specialist country is false. Not yet. But second, they also talk about the idea where it's stable, So here's the thing. If we talk about stability, the fact that this is a developing country where people still have the glorification happening for a specialist job, where specialist job is seen as something that proved you to be very successful, mean that this job is the one that is going to be overcrowded, which means that you have to keep on becoming the number one. You have to keep on becoming the forward player. You have to be the major player here to then have the sustainability. If you become a chef, then you have to have a certain measure of skill. Your food have to be interesting. Your restaurant have to be have a pummel to then you to increase and get more customers. And if not, then you will fail. You will go bankrupt, and at the end of the day, you don't have any kind of other skill other than the specialty that is not even backed by the formal education. You will not go anywhere. At the end of the day, you will still stuck in the same situation. You will still stuck in the idea of poverty. So I don't understand how they're going to achieve their goals to then have a better life or escape from the poverty chamber. I'm going to only talk about two things in my speech. First, in terms of opportunity cost, and second, in terms of harm if we then still force ourselves to become a specialist. So first, let's talk about opportunity cost. Understand, as an average student coming from a low-income family, I must understand the realistic picture of my career, right? It is not going to be feasible for me to enter a good institution because I am afraid. It will also not be feasible for me to compete because then I have to compete against privileged people or even average people that can access a lot more educational system than I. So this means that if I want to at least fulfill my basic need, I have to take the most short time solution, right? Because if I want to become a specialist, in example, if I want to become a doctor, I have to graduate in minimum years of 8 years. I have to take another specialty lesson that's going to take even more than 10 years, which means that if my goal is going to fulfill the basic need, it will not be achieved because at the end of the day, it's going to take so much time to get towards a position which I have to continue on competing with other people that is going to be having more advantage than I. But let's say if I choose to become a generalist, what is the main difference between a generalist education and specialist education is one have to be contingent open formal education of formal of the greater education, because let's be real, in specialist occupation, the greater the name of institution you have, the more title that you have is the one that is going to be the major decision point of your career, right? This is different between a generalist because they know that you only have the basic skill in many different aspects. Like you become a jack of all trades. So at the end of the day, the job that you're going to take will not take any kind of specialization at all. They will not give you a job to then do something complex that needs a certain degree of specialization because you are a generalist, right? Which also brings a flexibility. The difference is because a specialist that you have to continue on focus on that one job alone. But we say if you become a generalist, you can have 2 to 3 jobs at the same time because you have the basic skill for it. That it means that even if we get an average pay from that job, because we can flexibly take more than one job at one time, it's still going to be okay for us. Rather than in the side of the house where they have to keep on competing in opportunity cost towards a payment that they cannot afford, towards an education system that they cannot get access to begin with. So the change of competition will not be feasible, opportunity cost will be so much severe, it's better to become a generalist. But second, let's talk about the harm if then we force ourselves to continue competing inside the realist. Let's consider the fact that maybe we can access the competition, but can we compete with them? We say we cannot, because let's be realistic. Like I said before, the privileged people still have their privilege. I keep on competing. If I then enter a specialist job as a doctor, I have to become the best doctor to gain even more payroll, right? I have to continue competing. And what this is going to bring? We say, as an average person, when you are forced to keep on competing against people that you already know and consider to be more better than you, it's going to be such a letdown towards our mental condition, right? We say it is far better to have a happy life working as a generalist, which means that you cannot have a high payment job because that is their main their main advantage, right? Because they want to get a better payment, which we say is not exclusive, because coming from a lower economical family, we do not have to bet ourselves in luxury anyway. We only need to fulfill our basic needs, which is why we say it's going to be better for us to let go of those unrealistic value and becoming a generalist. Because even if we are able to enter the competition, we will not be able to compete. It will be such a letdown towards our mental condition. We're going to be hampered even more in the future, where we are going to continuously become stressed from the job that we cannot compete in, from having to constantly studying even more to catch up with people that is certainly 10 steps forward from us. So we say that is the second cause of harm from the opportunity and second from your own mental condition if we then pursue the unrealistic value of becoming a specialist. So in conclusion, we say that one, because of the cost that is pretty much impossible for us to afford based on our realistic value that we are average, we cannot compete with the privileged people. I already told you, even if we want to compete, that it is not possible. It's going to be such a letdown and becoming such an opportunity cost. I'm very proud to propose.
Great. Thank you for the speech. To open the case of closing up, I call upon the opposition member of opposition.
Am I audible? Ladies and gentlemen, what missing under this debate is the characterization of the context of social lower individuals. If you see the motion context, person that want to follow a general path may only know a little information or little knowledge to some specific subject. Because government, if they talk about emergency situation, for example, in a time of crisis and saying, oh, opportunity will come to us, we say no, because if government really needs resources in the time of crisis, they will search for an economic researcher, for example, that to fix our economic crisis or other crisis. It means on their side, an average student from lower social class will only become a blue-collar worker, for example, and they close the opportunity for this person to jump higher. Because under closing opposition, we're going to be more realistic. How, for example, by focusing on spatial condition, it is the most suitable condition in the developing countries, right? Because on our side, since the beginning, if you want to be a doctor, teacher, or even an army, we still support them because they interpret this as a passion, ladies and gentlemen. Passion is very important because you will do alternative to actually prepare other preventive action. If there is a lot of competitors inside the world or other company, they already have a bigger starting point from us, ladies and gentlemen. Because if government then to say how it's more accessible in developing countries, the tendency of work is still use a connection, the power of their parents, for example. Like privileged rich student will most likely do other alternatives like do a connection and the power of their parents. Compared to us that coming from a very lower social class, we do not have these alternatives, gentlemen. What we have is the only reason for us to actually be able to win against this kind of person. There is only characterization why we could exactly win under this situation. Closing opposition will provide this. But first of all, they say the general path career has a better opportunity in industry, for example. But we say no. Right now, the goal of industry like Bukalapak or Tokopedia in Indonesia, what they need is not only a general job like accountant, for example. It's not only accountant, but they see more an accountant that has a specialty like digital business and so on and so forth. This is why when we focus on spatial talent, we're going to have a preventive action to know what is our opportunity that is suitable for our knowledge, for example. Therefore, on their side, they will put these individuals in a very dangerous situation where we do not have any coming from a person that do not have any preparation at all. We don't have any alternative to actually opt in under this competition, right? Closing opportunity will prove to you why competition is still better affordable under us of the house. Because in order to achieve a dream or passion, for example, we're going through a lot of processes, struggle, for example, a lot of competitors, including but not limited, are competitors that already have a privilege since the first place. They need to be they need to prove to us first, right? SEO will be the only side that characterize how the condition isn't suitable at all for this kind of person. Because in developing countries, we face a lot of competitors. That access is a highly privileged parent, for example. But in special job, we use a career path as our own patient. It means we're going to have a more rational decision, for example, before opting to certain opportunity. We're going to have a more rational calculation as to whether this path is suitable for us or not. Whether the area that we come from is be able to government demands for a job for us in the end of the day, right? But why general path isn't suitable in the condition of developing countries? In developing countries, in order for government to recruit a worker, they most likely enter and want to attract it to an already person that has a patient, for example, and has a bigger knowledge for some specific talent. That I mentioned a case of Bukalapak, for example, that right now not only need an accountant, but more specific to what this accountant can provide to you in order for this company or government is attracted to us. By focusing on special path, for example, we'll have a better option, which kind of option that is suitable for our knowledge as a social lower class, because we don't have any a higher starting point to pursue education as compared to this kind of rich kid, for example, that live in Jakarta or Bandung, right? Notice that we're in an area that's very do not have any accessible for education. But notice that government and also company in developing countries want to fulfill the needs and the demands of what the opportunity that could exactly suitable for them. Under their certain house, they want to put us in a position where we will face a lot of competitors that already have an alternative to pursue a better education. For us, the only reason for us as individuals from lower class area is that to actually prepare ourselves to enter a lot of the competition. Because in the status quo, the only alternative for us to face those privileged higher students is by learning that since the beginning what is the better option for us. What are the opportunities that is exactly suitable for us to be pursued? Like, is there any scholarship under this kind of condition, or how in my area is it suitable to pursue that kind of option, right? And if at the end they feel that it is hard, for example, they will have a preventive action to change their dream and career path and focus to other things and focus to other specific talents, right? Under the side, when they create a lot of option, people like this person who don't have any rational option, which kind of interest that is suitable for us. On their side, even if they want to be able to go to everywhere, but they only know a little knowledge and information, and they don't have any ability to actually right now control all this kind of option, right, ladies and gentlemen, since the starting point is still there. Moreover, in developing countries competition, the HRA or government is still have a stereotypes that individuals or students coming from specific area like Jakarta and Bandung is more likely have a better, higher opportunity for us. And in order to exactly face this tough competition, we need to prepare ourselves in order to compete, ladies and gentlemen, to be seen as visible and seen as good as these kind of individuals, and better to opt out from these kind of stereotypes. What we need is exactly prepare our staff to focus on one option that is exactly suitable for us. But even if this option is no longer, for example, no longer suitable for us, we already know this since the beginning before we jump into the job opportunity, and we have more options to actually change our path if that's the case, right? We can see that on our side, our opportunity may not be many as them, but the chance to get job is more faster, ladies and gentlemen, because the most likely option for us to be recruited from the from company and government is more likely to have a better opportunity. On their side, it takes longer. If the crisis happen, so we question them how are we going to have the able to be seen visible as compared to your own student. They never prove that. Seriously, on the side, they prove to you this characterization. Proud to open the
Okay, thank you for the speech. To close the case of closing off, I call upon Government Whip.
Am I audible? Okay. I'm starting 3, 2, 1. Two things my speech. Firstly, can you actually compete? Secondly, what if you can compete? What will happen if you can compete? I'm going to prove why it's going to be bad in oppositions of the house. But firstly, on the issue of can we actually compete? OO actually come up here and say that their goal is to survive economically and to climb up social economy ladder. But here's the thing. OO bring up a characterization of jobs such as barbers and etc. that they say that it doesn't really need high education. I think that this is a wrong characterization, right? Because the characterization that should be defended by oppositions of the house is the characterization of special jobs such as doctors and so on and so forth that really need high education, that really need you to study high, to go to good university and so on and so forth, need you to compete with a lot of people who are privileged enough and so on and so forth. But then, even if they say that, okay, scholarship if even exists, firstly, OG already explained that it is not accessible. But secondly, we said that as SCG, we said that even if it is accessible, even if you can get scholars, even if you are from lower social economic class and you can still get access to this scholarship, it's still going to be hard for you to compete inside the university. Because in university, it's not only, it is not only exclusive towards low social economic class in that university. There are also middle class people, upper class people, and so on and so forth, which they have privilege, they have their own, a lot of money to get a better education, to buy better books and so on and so forth, in which I don't think that it is really, I don't think it is easy for us to access in lower economic class, right? But secondly, OO want to play in the scenario of doctors or and so on and so or want to play in the scenario of chef or barber and so on and so forth. Firstly, if they want to play on the scenario of chef, I think that it is wrong if they want to say that it doesn't really require high education, because we say that even chef also need to access a lot of high education, need to access university, culinary school, and so on and so forth. I don't get the idea why they bring up why chefs do not need high education. But secondly, when they talk about barber, right, they said that, okay, it is easy for us because barber do not need high education, and so on and so forth. Firstly, I think that it is contradictory with their goal of climbing social economic ladder, because if they want to survive economically and they want to climb social economic ladder, they first need to prove to us why in the rest of the house they are going to get a better paying job, because we said barber might not get that high paying jobs and so on and so forth. So we said that if it will not reach their goal to climb social economic ladder. But secondly, they talk about how in government side, company will not hire us and so on and so forth. Firstly, let's understand what company is after in the status quo. Company is after people who have higher education and so on and so forth, who graduate university. So if OO want to play on the scenario of we do not need high education, then also in the rest of the house, it is inexclusive, right? Because in the rest of the house, in OO, they are still not going to get hired by this company anyway if they want to play in the scenario of no high education, right? But nextly, let's talk about the overpopulation, right? We think that because of the fact that this is a developing country and this is highly populated country where there are abundance of people, there are a lot of people in this country, meaning that there are also a lot of demands, such as demands to be doctor, demands to be, basically those jobs that need high education and so on and so forth. What does this mean? This means that firstly, if you succeed to get to university, you still need to compete with abundance of people. You need to compete with middle, high class people inside the university, meaning that it's really hard for us to actually compete with them inside the university. But secondly, even if you can compete inside that university, it's still going to be hard for you to survive inside your job. For example, even if in the best scenario of team opposition, they become a doctor or any job that is really, really hard. Firstly, it's really hard for them to actually survive that. Why? Because doctors is something that people demand, because there are a lot of people, like millions, hundreds of people, thousands of people trying to be a doctor. So even if they try and succeed to become a doctor, it's really hard for them to actually survive in being a doctor, because they need to constantly challenge themselves. They need to constantly improve themselves being a doctor and so on and so forth. They need to constantly compete with these people that have this high privilege and so on and so forth. Especially when we are talking about these people who are privileged, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of brothers and so on and so forth, where they have their family lineage, where their family is doctor and so on and so forth. They can easily get a lot of this image as a good doctor in comparison to us, even if in their best scenario. But nextly, let's talk about the mental health issue in this track, because Adiba has already explained to you about how even if you can succeed even if you can be a doctor, it's really hard for you because you have to constantly challenge yourself, you have to constantly improve yourself, and in the end of the day, you will only waste your time in order for you. You will only get a harder time in order for you to actually maintain your own mental condition, because because in the worst case scenario of you actually fail, you will only constantly blame yourself. Why am I failing, and so on and so forth? Why am I actually not being capable enough to actually compete with these people, even though I try so hard, right? So in terms of mental condition, it's only going to be worse in the of the house. They're going to get more stress and so on and so forth. And all of those things will easier to come in when we are talking about specialist job, when it needs really high education, and there are abundance of people inside there and so on and so forth, where it is really overcrowded and it is really demanded by a lot of people, meaning that you need to constantly compete with people, you need to constantly improve yourself, and also in the end of the day, you will only harm yourself in the worst case scenario if you fail, right? So in this debate, I think that it's better in CG. Moving on to CO. CO said that it is really important for us to have passion and so on and so forth, to be a doctor and so on and so forth. Firstly, they never prove to us why this passion is really important, and secondly, they never prove to us why this passion will automatically make you succeed, right? Because it seems that CO is highly continued upon, okay, I have passion, I will succeed. It is not that easy. They need to prove to us why they will succeed, considering the fact that we have already explained to you about how in university you need to compete with middle, high class people. You also need to, even if you graduate university, you still need to compete with a lot of people. There are abundance of people. You still need to compete, and your mental health is something that is really important, because with that, if your mental health is something that is unstable, it still mean your struggle to become a doctor and so on and so forth is meaningless anyway. We propose.
Great. Thank you for the speech. To close the entire debate, I call upon the opposition whip.
Check, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
I'm sorry, but I cannot turn on my camera because of my connection. Okay, wait. I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. I think the problem with both proposition bands as a whole is that they offer many negative things about being a specialist, but doesn't offer any comparative about why then being a generalist is even better under their set of the house, right? Because they talk about many things, like they talk about access, they talk about capitals, they talk about privilege and competition, but they never explain to you why then the competition, for example, as being generalist is even better, and it's much higher chances for you to compete as a generalist, right? They also talk to you about capital or but privileged people exist, but they never talk to you but why them being a generalist you can also compete with privileged people under the set of the house, right? I think CEO is the most important teams in this debate. Why so? Because we're the only team that talk to you, but why then the industry in the developing world is changing, right? But why then the industry in the developing world is actually having higher demand for specialized worker in the first place? I think the most important exchange in this debate is about how then the industry of the developing world work, and how then why the specialist is the one that is suitable for the changing of the industry of the developing world to begin with. I'm going to talk about two things. Number one, I'm going to talk about how are we capable on becoming specialists. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the job field, about the competition, and etc. Firstly, let's talk about how are we capable on becoming specialists. The main problem that Clubs brought to you is that university is expensive. That there are that it is only for privileged people and etc. Right? But the problem is that problem is that they question our access toward university, but notice under their slide they never explain to you how then the access toward generalized education is much more accessible, right? Because I say college. Yes, college is expensive, for example, but notice how job field is very competitive right now. That many job field actually require college degree for you to be able to qualify in the first place, right? And much more problematic is that how you get access to this kind of generalized knowledge is never blocked by the proposition side in the house as well. I think under their side, because they only say bad things about university, and the result you will end up only being a blue collar worker under both proposition side of the house, because they does not go to university. And I say that university degree is much more important in this debate, right? But most importantly, I think the access to generalized education is not explained on the rest of the house. But secondly, second point on this issue, I think it's much right now it's becoming more and more accessible to gain degree and to gain access to a university, right? Why so? Because in Indonesia, for example, we have Kartu Indonesia Pintar, for example, we have bidik misi, right? And I think in most state university, we have tuition based on your capacity of your parents to actually pay the tuition, right? So we say the access to university, if you are even if we lower economic, even if we have lower economic background, the tuition in itself will actually adjust toward our capacity to pay as a whole, right? I think that it's becoming more and more accessible under their side. But thirdly, I think the access toward specialist knowledge is much more easier to gain comparatively toward access to generalist knowledge, right? Why so? Because when you go to university, when you go into the faculty of economics, for example, you have access to the library, you have access to the lecturer, right? And you also have the connection to the future company that you might work in other outside of the house, right? That specialize in those things, for example, right? I think the connection with lecturer, the access to the library, the access to articles and journal, for example, is much more easier when you specialize on those things, right? Comparatively with the rest of the house, I think it's harder for you to gain a whole lot basic knowledge of so many things because you do not know how you gain those things in the first place, right? The first place, right? So we say that the access to the knowledge is much more easier if you go to the specialist in the first place. But lastly, then, Rafat have told you, right? The specialist that we want, for example, is most likely the patient that we are passionate about, right? I think the specialist is more likely in which field where we have most aptitude in, for example, right? So we say if we have the talent to becoming software engineer, most likely the software engineering side is the one that we specialize about ourselves, right? So we say that we say that even if we are average, because we choose the one that we are passionate about, the access toward the knowledge of specialty is much easier for you to get under ourselves, right? It's bad under their side when you do not have the explanation about how then the access toward the generalist knowledge is more accessible. Second point of issue then. Let's talk about the job field and the opportunity, right? Firstly, let's talk about the job field of the generalist people under their side of the house, right? What you need to understand with developing countries is that they have high population but low job supply, right? Under their side, it's bad because you are only an average student, right? You will lose someone that has capital. You will lose to someone that has connection to good companies, for example, right? You will lose to someone that has good starting point, right? And you do not have any bargaining power because you are only average and you do not have any specialty under the side of the house, right? This is why the idea of competing with privileged people that Revan brought to you matters, because the idea of competing with privilege will not happen successfully, will not happen under their side of the house because the company will only choose the one that is privileged because you do not have anything special to offer the companies, right? I think O brought to you the idea about how then it is based on luck, right? CEO block to something that you will have to compete with someone that has capital. You will have to compete with someone that has connection. But why so? But why then the job field of specialized is much better under outside, right? Because Revan have told you, right, that specialist demand is higher right now. How? Because the industry is growing, right? Because the industry is growing, developing, and changing. Because we see companies that also specialize on certain things, like Bukalapak that specialize in online shopping, for example, right? The point in this issue is that, for example, that Bukalapak need an economic analyst that not only understand the basic thing about economics, but also understand how big data works, for example, right? This means the industry switched to demanding more specialized workers under status quo. But why then this is good under closing of position, because then you already have those specialized knowledge, right? So even if the job field is much smaller under outside, the demand for your knowledge and your skill is much higher. It's much higher and and is seek higher by things Bukalapak or Tokopedia and outside, right? Under their side, it is impossible for them to compete in this highly specialized changing industry, right? Why so? Because under their side, if you have basic general knowledge, for example, you will only go toward toward a mediocre company, for example, that only offer a bad wage, for example, right? And it is impossible for them to go to Bukalapak because then Bukalapak need to train them first, for example. It will require a lot of resources and time to change the generalist and to change the general knowledge and skills, right, to become more specialist, right? And it's much better if you want to talk about better wages and better wages on the outside when we are the worker that Bukalapak demands, for example, right? I think it's much but I think it's much better on the dark side because the competition is only focusing on the specialized, and on the other side, you will have to compete with those privileged community, with those that has access to work capital. I think it's better to compete in specialized market. We beg to oppose.
Great. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for the speech. I will be making my verbal adjudication and decision. You can wait here. Yeah, while I'll make these things. Thanks.